This is a tournament that's been more and more attended over the last few months here, and it had close to 100 entrants this last time it got put on, and I think it's really interesting to look through these and see what the early standard meta post hook looks like. And I'm not going to spend all the time in the world on this, but again, I think it's a really interesting exercise to see what the world looks like after the Meathook ban. And I don't think that all of these lists are set in stone, and I don't think these standings are set in stone. This is one tournament, not very much data in terms of sample size or anything like that. So just keep that in mind. But and in the early days of any format, whether it's after a set comes out or rotation or a card gets banned, in this case, people are usually going to settle into what they know is strong. And I think that there's some examples of that here. But at the same time, there's some really refreshing stuff here too that we didn't see like any of pre-hook ban. So let's take a quick look here at Grixis midrange, which won the tournament 7-0. And don't worry, I'm going to go to this page so you can actually see the thing. And I'm going to do this so you don't have to see so much ad. I know how much you guys hate ads. I do too. Don't worry. But when it comes to stuff like this, I want sites like MTG Melee to get paid and continue being able to operate. So ads are fine in this case. But this deck should look really familiar, and as a matter of fact, this is like the most familiar looking deck of any of the decks here, so I'm not going to spend too long on it. There are some interesting things about the Grixis deck that went 7-0. That's respectable. We should talk about that, right? But interesting things, right? For the normal stuff, you got Blood Tithe Harvester, Corpse Appraiser. This is one of the biggest reasons to play blue in this deck. There's a Rakdos deck a little later that looks really similar to this. It doesn't play Corpse Appraiser. It doesn't play the main deck counter spells like this deck has. This deck has 3 copies of Make Disappear and a copy of Negate in the main deck, along with a fair number of spells, right? You know, you got Cut Down, just a couple copies of that, 2 copies of Abrade, 2 copies of Infernal Grasp, 2 copies of Voltage Surge. This used to be 4 copies in the Grixis decks, but it's survived down to 2 copies. A lot of decks have cut it entirely. But, you know, I assume that a lot of people think that in a post-hook standard, you're going to see a lot of aggro decks with small creatures. So it makes sense to play, 2 main deck Cut Down along with 2 main deck Voltage Surge, because you're probably not going to have to sacrifice too many artifacts to actually make Voltage Surge kill a guy a lot of the time. Voltage Surge stops seeing as much play because Sheoldred has 5 toughness. That's one of the main reasons. There are other reasons, but that's one of the main reasons. But as smaller creatures re-enter the format now, I can see Voltage Surge being a good call. But the deck also obviously plays Fable of the Mirror Breaker. Right, it plays a couple of copies of Sheoldred itself. So, again, familiar deck with a couple of cuts. It doesn't play like Evelyn the Covetous anymore, the 5-mana vampire legend that draws a card off of both libraries when it comes into play, and every time another vampire comes into play, it does that too. You'd usually see 1 or 2 copies of that, but I don't think any of the Grixis decks over the last couple of weekends have been playing that card either. They've all cut it, mostly for Sheoldred, I would assume. But this deck I'm not, again, going to spend too long on because it's probably one you've seen and played against a lot. Plays 26 lands. That's kind of a little bit notable, right, I guess. So some cool things about this, but mostly early counter spells, good removal, solid removal, really good creatures in terms of how much mana you're paying, the rate that you're paying for a card like Blood Tithe Harvester or Corpse Appraiser or Sheoldred, right? And then Fable of the Mirror Breaker, which is the best card in Standard. So, and copying Harvester or Appraiser is a great reason to, again, play blue in the deck. We see these Fable of the Mirror Breaker decks a lot that play Blood Tithe Harvester. But I think that adding blue and playing Corpse Appraiser is a great reason to add blue so you can copy that with Fable. But anyway, the next deck is one that's been lurking here and there, but we actually haven't seen that much of until now. And this deck went 6-1, which is a pretty respectable little record here. Larry Chang with Bant midrange, and don't be fooled, this isn't straight up Bant midrange, this is actually a Storm the Festival deck. This card has been kind of poking its head back through the clouds in Standard for the last 3 weeks, something like that, 2-3 weeks. You see some results for Storm the Festival, and it's always a cool, exciting card to see in results, but I'm never sure that it's the real deal once the format kind of settles, 6 mana is a lot to pay for a card, and sometimes it whiffs and stuff, but there's some really good hits in this deck. This is the first time we're seeing Wandering Emperor, but we're going to see this a lot. But one thing you'll note as we go through a little piece of data from this tournament is that aside from the Wandering Emperor and the very occasional Elthus Resplendent, which we'll see next, really not a whole lot of Planeswalkers and 0 goose egg copies of Liliana of the Veil in the top 15 decks or something like that in this tournament. No Liliana whatsoever. Some of her usual cohorts are there in pretty high number, but not Liliana of the Veil, amazingly. But the Emperor's all over this top 15, but she's just about the only Planeswalker save another two here or there. Elspeth, Kaito Shizuki's in a deck or two, but she's just about the only Planeswalker seeing real solid play in Standard right now. But this deck also plays Resplendent. You see some decks playing this from time to time. Get some decent hits. And Ren and 7, just a one of. Tameo, just a one of, and I respect these being one ofs. That makes sense to me. Anointed Peacekeeper is a good hit, and it's also a great 3-drop, right? Shauna the Purifying Blades gains you some life sometimes. You see this in a lot of these Bant decks. Dennick Pious Apprentice, you're starting to see this card a lot more in the Esper list, so it makes sense it would port over to the Bant list. Really good card in Standard right now. And again, if you think there's going to be more aggro, G-Man 2-3 lifelink, brick wall some of those like early plays. Seems like a good idea. Catilda, you're seeing a little bit more of this too, right? And this is kind of a human Z list, so Catilda gets some value. Gallagreater's but only the one copy, and only one copy of AO Scott Hall, which you usually only see one copy of in most cases. So no surprise there. Teachings of the Kirin, you're seeing a lot more of this card lately. Great against Invoke Despair, right? Wedding Announcement, you're going to see a lot more of this too, post-Hook ban. And then Grafted Identity, which you don't see a lot of, but you do almost always see in these Bant Storm the Festival decks, because it's a good hit off that card, and you're not playing a whole lot of main deck removal outside of stuff like this. So it's good to have a removal piece that you can hit with Storm the Festival, basically. But not something as fragile as like Brutal Cathar or something, So I like the picks here, but I've always thought that Grafted Identity was a little spicy. Maybe there's probably something better than that, but Grafted Identity seems to be the way people slot with this deck a lot. But it's cool to see the Storm the Festival deck doing stuff. But another cool deck is the Yin to the Yang. Mono Black mid-range has been like a thing this entire Standard so far until the Hook ban, but now we're seeing Mono White Control kind of do stuff in a tournament here or there. This isn't the only time we've seen Mono White Control do stuff this season. It's kind of a solid deck. It's just got good cards. I think the two best colors in Standard right now probably are white and black. As evidenced again by 4 Wandering Emperor, we see Elspeth Resplendent in this deck. Ambitious Farmhand getting into the pool a little bit. This is a cool little card. Make sure that you get your planes. Make sure you get your 3 drops. Which are very important in this deck, by the way. You got Sanctuary Warden. This card pops up every now and again, and it's always like really solid when it hits the table. We play with it a bunch on stream. It's always good. 4 Reckoner Bankbuster. White decks want to draw cards. They don't have a lot of ways to do that. So Reckoner Bankbuster is kind of our Maze Mind Tome or artifact that draws cards. Wedding Announcement, of course, 4 copies of that. 4 copies of Restoration to get stuff back and just be solid. This is a good card, Ramp, the deck wants that because it plays stuff like Sanctuary Warden, right? Farewell, good little reset piece there. Maybe the best sweeper in the entire Standard. A March of Otherworldly Light, really reliable removal piece. Destroy Evil, great right now against Fable, Wedding Announcement, and a few other enchantments, Leyline Binding and stuff. So just a really good card right now. Kills Shieldreds too. And Fateful Absence, just reliable removal piece. Also, you get to play Roadside Reliquary in this deck because you might have an artifact and an enchantment on the table. The deck plays both, so very likely that you do. So you can draw 2 off of this. And then maybe replay it with Sarah Paragon if the deck played Sarah Paragon, but it doesn't. But I was expecting to see it in the board, but it's not there. With Wedding Announcement and Restoration, Ambitious Farmhand, it's like, I don't know. Maybe it's just me. The deck does not play like hardly any actual creatures. But I really like Sarah Paragon, I guess. But Mono White Control is a cool little deck. Mono Blue Tempo is a deck you will absolutely be seeing more often. I think that this is a big winner. Not necessarily because Meathook was so good against it, but because of all of the little things, the little fallout from Hook being banned. How the format will shape and mold around that, I think probably benefits Mono Blue to some degree. Now, if Mono Blue comes up against a really just lightning fast aggro deck that has the best 7 in its opening end and they're on the play, right? Like, I think that aggro deck will probably give Mono Blue a run for its money. But for the most part, we're seeing a return to mid-range. And in that case, Mono Blue is a really, really good deck. Just a fantastic deck. We saw Grixis and Mono White are a couple of decks that we've looked at like so far, right? And I think that mono blue is really good against a format full of those cards because you got your early counter spells, and then you got your decent creatures like Delver of Secrets, Haughty Djinn, right? You have to protect these guys, but it's fairly easy to do that with all the counter spells. And I think the deck, some versions of it play like 20 counter spells. Let's count them up. Four main deck copies of Negate. What's the last time you saw that? 4-8. Get out of here, Negate. 4-8. 19-11. Slip out the back counts. 12, 13, 14 that I can see right here. And then the sideboard has 4 Essence Capture, 2 Disdainful Stroke. Slip out the back again. I'm surprised this deck, it doesn't have as many creatures as it sometimes has. So maybe that's why it's not playing like Shore Up and stuff like that. It's not playing Tolarian Terror main deck, which it very often does. So I'm a little surprised by that too. But this deck just cuts all the fat. It's like I'm going to get one creature on the table. I'm going to ride that creature. And I can see that working too in a more mid-rangey format where you're not racing aggro so much. So, you know, I expect to see multiple versions of this deck in the next month or two. Not necessarily take hold, but get a foothold, get a place in Standard. 4 Negate. It's amazing. But this is a solid deck right now in a couple of different forms. Let's look at Mono Blue Tempo. It's probably on its way to becoming the newest bad guy in Standard, right? You know, this Grixis midrange from Christian Woodcock right here is functionally identical in most ways to the Grixis midrange list we've already looked at. I don't think there are just about any changes here. So look at Rakdos midrange next, which I won't spend much time on because like I was saying earlier, this is kind of like the Grixis list, but they just cut blue. What do they cut it for? Well, they're playing Graveyard Trespasser in the main deck along with Tenacious Underdog. A lot of the Grixis decks won't play these cards. Even though I think Tenacious Underdog is definitely a good call. And then Soul Transfer, which is interesting. This will take out Planeswalkers, which again, aside from Wandering Emperor, there just really aren't that many seeing play. But maybe it's worth taking out a Wandering Emperor, from time to time. Still, just being able to blow up any creature is really sweet too. But one way or the other, Soul Transfer, really, really cool addition to the deck. Now, what you may notice is Invoke Despair. Some of the Grixis lists do play this. Matter of fact, most of the Grixis lists play this. The Rakdos list plays it. The Mono Black deck, plays it. Freudian slip. The Mono Black deck there plays it. So this is one of the most played cards in the entire format, especially now that you may have noticed. You're not seeing Tenacious Underdog pop up as much. There was one top 15 from 3 weeks ago, I want to say, 3 weeks or a month ago. That was a tournament with about 1,000 entrants in it, which is a lot of entrants, a pretty good data set. And, excuse me, the top 8 of that tournament, the most played card throughout those decks was Tenacious Underdog. We have not seen that at all in this case. One of the most played cards is still Invoke Despair, though. Because it's just really good. I mean, you can't talk about the best decks in Standard without talking about Invoke Despair or Fable, which this deck gets to play both, right? But so do the Grixis lists. I'm not really sure what sets this deck apart, honestly. I think that Corpse Appraiser is worth adding blue to the deck, but this deck is probably a little more consistent on the mana front. You know, Graveyard Trespasser is a very strong card. Tenacious Underdog is a very strong card. This deck plays all 4 Bankbuster, which you don't often always see, but still, no Liliana in this deck. No Obnixilis outside of the sideboard. There are 2 in the sideboard. But interesting little deck in that it just cut the blue and tried to kind of focus on what red-black can do best and still play the powerful cards, you know. Jund Midrange up next. You might think this is another Invoke Despair deck, but it is not, actually. It plays Cut Down, Infernal Grasp, Unleash the Inferno, which is a neat one to see. You really just don't see it every day, especially all 3 copies. But the spiciest card in this deck is Riveteer's Charm at 4 copies, which you just don't see. Usually you see 1 or 2 copies of Riveteer's Charm, but all 4 isn't that good. I think it could be. Draws cards, you know, functions basically as removal for the best creature or whatever on the table. And also, exiling a card from their graveyard is better than you think, but the deck also plays Graveyard Trespasser as a 4-up to be able to do that, you know. Blood Tithe Harvester. Tenacious Underdog, Shieldred, so a lot of stuff that's kind of ported over from the Grixis and Rakdos list. Bankbuster, Fable, right? So again, very similar, but why add green to this deck? Well, the deck plays a card that's actually double green. I mean, outside of Charm and Unleash the Inferno. The deck plays 4 Workshop War Chief. I may have spoken too quickly, you know. This might be the spiciest card in the deck, especially as a playset, you know, like 4 Workshop War Chief. You're playing that, boss? Yeah, it's really solid card, honestly, you know. No Soul of Windgrace, no Titan of Industry, anything like that. We're going to copy Workshop War Chief with our Fable of the Mirror Breaker, and I actually really like that call. Made him go 5-2 in this tournament, so that's not bad, you know. This is not a mono-white aggro deck. This is the deck that we're playing tonight. It is innocuously labeled mono-white aggro to get you to not look at it. Oh, it's mono-white aggro. But no, this is actually kind of an Angels deck. And I saw this and instantly wanted to play it. I had a couple other decks I was looking at playing tonight. You know, Stick Fingers and Red-White Midrange, I think is a really good deck. A couple of things that I thought about getting on, but when I saw this, I was like, I want to play this. I want to see if this will work. This is technically Mardu Angels in terms of the mana base, and it's got Archangel of Wrath, so you want red and black mana some of the time. But in terms of, you know, all the main mana costs in the deck is just all white cards. But you get to play, you know, Giada, Archangel of Wrath, Extraction Specialist, always a cool card to see. Sanctuary Warden, again. Sarah Paragon, I love this card. A couple of Inspiring Overseers, why not? Good to get back with Sarah Paragon, right? Draw cards and stuff. Wedding Announcement, again, a 4 of. Restoration as a 2 of, and there's a lot of good stuff for it to get back. Reckoner Bankbuster, again, you see a lot of this card in the top 15. And Invoke Justice to grab, like, big stuff out of the yard. Get that Sarah, not Sarah, but that Sanctuary Warden. A couple of Depopulate to reset the board, you know, Elspeth Resplendent to get nice stuff off the top, and of course Wandering Emperor is just maybe the other best card in Standard. Seeing a lot of this card too. So just a lot of neat stuff. You get Ambitious Farmhand to make sure you get your 3 and 4 drops because you're playing 5 and 6s in this deck and stuff. So I really like the idea of this. I haven't tried Angels in a long time. I think a lot of people have forgotten that that's a tribe that could work, right? But outside of just being a tribal deck, you have to build tribal decks like this in today's Standard. You can't just be like, I'm going to get tribal synergy, and here's an Anthem effect, and it's going to make me win the game. You can't really do that anymore. It's not that simple. So it's a tribal deck that's also like a really functional mid-range deck, you know. So I want to try this out, see how it goes. I do wish this deck had more removal, but I think what this deck's philosophy might be is, you know, depopulate when things get too crazy, Wandering Emperor to take out the big threats, and for the most part, just fly over them. Not a whole lot of flying in Standard right now. So let's just fly over for the win and see if that works. You know, we have stuff like Reckoner Bankbuster to draw cards, Sarah Paragon to get us back on board, so a nice little mid-range deck here. It gets card advantage in interesting ways, so I want to try that tonight once we get to the games, which won't be too much longer. We're going to look next at an Esper mid-range deck, and this starts a trio of Esper decks that are all a little bit different, but not that much different. You know, Wandering Emperor, Kaito Shizuki, these decks focused or function as kind of the basis for the Esper LSL core decks that I was building for the video that just came out. If you haven't seen it yet, please go watch that video. I put a lot of work into it. But that video, I decided to just kind of build one of these Esper decks, but play LSL core in it and cut a card or 2 here or there, right? I had to cut Dennick because we had a lot of graveyard effects that I wanted to use, right? So I cut Dennick, and that was kind of how we got LSL core into the deck, but it was functionally similar to something like this. Wandering Emperor, Kaito Shizuki, Rafine, you know. If you're going to play a legend the turn after LSL core, I think that Rafine is a really good call, and Rafine wants to draw cards. It's a great way to do that, you know. You get to play Tenacious Underdog as a 4 of in this deck. Obscura Interceptor along with Urtai, so your 4 drops are just all like counter spells. Another 4 Wedding Announcement, which is since again Hookup and just becoming one of the best cards in Standard. But again, early counter spells like Make Disappear. We saw that in the Grixis deck. We're seeing that here too. So kind of a blue-black base, you know, black creatures and removal and stuff like that, along with these blue like early game counter spells and the creatures that you splash for blue, like Rafine and Corpse Appraiser and stuff. Kind of a running theme in Standard right now, you know. Aside from that, the other Esper decks, the only reason I'm going to bring this one up is because of its creature distribution. This deck has 30 creatures and only 3 Infernal Grasp, are like the only 3 non-creature cards in the entire deck. So I just wanted to feature this real quick This deck also plays Jadar. This is actually much closer to the LSL Core build that I was on, if you want a deck that's close to that build. This deck utilizes Ratadribik of Yearborg. It plays 3 copies of this, and then basically nothing but Legends. So this is a really interesting version of kind of an Esper mid-range list that went, again, 5-2, I think, at this tournament, which is just fine. It's pretty good. I mean, I think these Esper decks are already wanting to play Rafine and Dinnick and Sheoldred as a matter of course, so why not go all the way? Was the philosophy. Oh, they play Urtai too, so they play enough Legends to screw it, you know? Well, just play the... just go Legends. But no Mirror Box, because that card is, in fact, pretty bad. Another Esper mid-range deck, but it's very similar to the first one that I showed you. Rakdos Burn. This one, really interesting. You might think, again, that this is just, you know, one of those Invoke Despair decks or something. But no, this is actually really, really neat. In the 1-drop slot, you got Kimano Faces Kakazan. You got to keep a Reckoner Raid. Both of these deal damage, like, immediately to your opponent, which is kind of neat, and then become 2/2s later. Lightning Strike, Play with Fire. Both of these can go face. That's kind of neat, you know. You got Sheoldred. I highlighted Squee, but you get Sheoldred. This also does damage to the face. Graveyard Trespasser does damage to the face, right? So all of this is kind of Thundering Raiju attacks and does damage where? To the face. Bloodthirsty Adversary comes in and recasts Lightning Strike or Play with Fire. So this is a really, really neat deck. I like the idea behind this like an awful lot. This feels kind of like the Boros decks that existed before rotation, but they're just using black instead of white. You know, you're not playing like Sunrise Cavalier or anything like that. Instead, you're leveraging black for Tenacious Underdog and Graveyard Trespasser and stuff like that. So you've also got an unconditional removal spell in Infernal Grasp, which I like. But just a cool little deck. Gets on board really fast, does damage quickly, and I like that it's got like 8 1-drops that immediately deal damage to your opponent. But it's also got like solid late game stuff, you know, Sheoldred and stuff. So it's just neat little deck. So I'd like to try this one out on stream at some point too. Aside from that, mono white mid-range again. This one is a little bit different, but not that much different, really, from the first deck. This one does play Banishing Slash, the thing that exiles like a tapped creature, or an artifact, or an enchantment. And then if you control an artifact and enchantment, you get a 2/2. It's that thing. Neat little card. It is. But, you know, another Jund mid-range, Mardu mid-range here went 4-2. And this one, I think might be the last one we look at. There's some cool stuff like Naya mid-range. I think is a neat deck. Is it Control? I think is a neat deck, but not really. That's might be the actual bad guy. But Mardu midrange is one that I think gets to play the strongest cards in the format. This is what I was talking about in the LSL Core video. You know, you get Wedding Announcement, and you get Fable of the Mirror Breaker. That's sick. That's really good. Giada, it's kind of an Angels deck. You know, Giada, 4 Inspiring Overseer, 4 Archangel of Wrath, 4 Sanctuary Warden, 3 Sarah Paragon, so it's very much an Angels deck. But also gets to copy its like Sanctuary Wardens with Fable of the Mirror Breaker, you know? Gets to play Wedding Announcement to boost all of its creatures. And then like just solid removal that all costs, you know, just a couple of mana. So I like this deck too. I considered playing this tonight. Kind of a Mardu Angels list. You're already playing Archangel of Wrath, so why not, right? But instead I'm going to go with the more focused mono white list. But I think that this is what I'm interested in too, because copying Sanctuary Warden with Fable seems really, really good to me. And we've done it on stream a couple of times before. Last deck I want to look at is Naya midrange because I have not really looked at it. All right, Wandering Emperor is a 4-up, makes sense. An Arlen is in here. It's 1 copy of Arlen in the top 15. 4 Gala Greeters, makes sense. 4 Llanowar Loam Speaker. Okay, a little bit of ramp. 4, oh, it's a Rith. Oh, okay, so it's not a Rith deck. It just plays 4 Rith because it's a fine card. You know, a 5-mana, 5/5 Flying Ward 2. At the beginning of your end step, if a creature or planeswalker an opponent controls dealt excess damage this turn. Okay, so it also just gives you dragons. I bet this is fine. It also plays Black Market Tycoon. You don't see that card every day. It's cool. Sarah Paragon to bring back your Gala Greeters, your Loam Speaker, your Tycoons, and your Wedding Announcements, and your Fable. So, okay, this is... Okay, I see what's going on here. And then 4 Strangle, 2 Lightning Strike. Strangle's pretty good if you're expecting a lot of aggro. 4 in the main is pretty... It's kind of a lot, in best of 3 at least. But yeah, one wrinkle that we're also seeing is people that want to play Wedding Announcement and Fable of the Mirror Breaker in the same deck. and how do you best do that? I'm surprised to not see Titan of Industry in this deck. You know, you got Llanowar Loam Speaker and Fable of the Mirror Breaker. That's ramp. Not like a 1 or 2 of Titan of Industry. Not going to do that. But yeah, again, another thing in this format is Wedding Announcement, Fable. How do you play these 2 cards together, and what's the best deck with those 2 cards? Which I think is neat. Hopefully the whole format doesn't become partially about that, you know. But still, that is basically like the top 15 to 18, you know, decks in this 100-person tournament. All the ones that went 5-2 and some of the ones that went 4-2 and 4-3. Because I think it's really interesting to look at. One takeaway from this is that, yeah, we see a lot of black still. You know, Grixis midrange, Rakdos midrange, Jund, Esper, Rakdos, Jund, Mardu. Yeah, so still kind of a pretty good spread of black decks in this format, but it still feels a little more fair now. And look at all the diversity. It's only one tournament, so again, not a lot of data, but still, you know, we got Grixis, we got Bant, we got Mono White, we got Mono Blue, we got Rakdos, we got Jund, and a Mono White Angels deck, which is completely different from the Mono White Control deck. All in the top 8, which is a pretty good distribution. If I saw this in 2012, I'd be like, well, that's pretty healthy standard, you know what I mean? So, you know, and even outside of the top 8 and 16, there's more decks. Esper, the Rakdos Burn deck, which looked cool, you know, the Mardu Angels deck, a Naya deck, well, that's in the top 17, but, you know, is it controlled? So, you know, just for this 1 week, I guess, it looked like a pretty decent, diverse standard as things kind of shake out. But, of course, we're still shaking things through the Siev? How do you pronounce that word? The Siev? The Sev? We're still shaking things through the screen at this point. And obviously, the big chunks like Grixis midrange, and Mono Blue Tempo, I think are going to stay, you know, unfiltered. They're going to stay in the format. But will these things like Bant Midrange, Mono White Control, you know, will these things stay in the format? Will they continue to climb? Will there be another deck that gets discovered in the next week or something else that moves up, like is it Control in another tournament or whatever? So there's still a lot of questions in this format, and we only have like a month left to play it, but it has become not necessarily the healthiest format ever, but a format where new things are possible since Hook has been banned. So I don't know if you're seeing a lot of diversity on Arena, but I'm seeing more diversity since Hook got banned. So this is a neat little standard right here where people are trying stuff they haven't tried in a while, like Angels and whatever. So I like it.